The heat in Mexico City on August 12, 1982, was more than just the midsummer sun. It was the stifling pressure of a shrinking treasury. When Finance Minister Jesus Herzog picked up the phone to call the U.S. Treasury, he wasn't just reporting a budget shortfall. He was signaling the end of an era. Mexico was out of dollars. The Mexican miracle was over, and as the news rippled south, the dominoes of Latin America began to fall. This was the start of the Latin American lost decade, the 1980s. In addition to Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile were held hostage by a mountain of debt that grew faster than their ability to service it. How did an entire region put itself in such a position? Let's start by examining the root causes of this financial calamity, the 1970s, when oil exporters became rich. In the late 1970s, the world was awash in petrodollars, or the dollars earned with the massive profits of oil-exporting nations. The 1973 oil embargo had led to the explosion of oil prices, making countries such as Saudi Arabia very rich. David Spiro writes that from 1973 to 1981, OPEC countries generated a current account surplus of $410 billion, the equivalent of $1.5 trillion today. A lot of this money was held by Western commercial banks, which then asked, what to do with this cash? The answer was Latin America, where economic growth had been strong. Brazil, for instance, had grown its GDP very fast in the 1970s, over 8% per year. Western bankers thus pitched Latin American governments, which then borrowed aggressively to fund massive infrastructure projects and keep industrializing. It seemed like a win-win situation at that point. But as shown by Reinhardt and Rogoff, the moneylenders shared the naive belief that default risks did not apply to the Latin nations. One of the main lenders to Latin countries, Walter Wriston of Citicorp, issued in 1982 some of the most infamous words in financial history. Countries don't go out of business. Their assets always exceed their liabilities, which is the technical reason for bankruptcy. Wriston did not seem to understand financial history. Sovereign nations have been defaulting on loans as early as the 1300s. Look at this table. Unfortunately, much of the debt taken by Latin American or LATAM countries in the 1970s was tied to floating interest rates. Inflation had been rising steadily and dangerously in the U.S. throughout the 1970s. And in 1979, the U.S. Fed under Paul Volcker got serious. They aggressively hiked interest rates to combat inflation. The result? The world plunged in a recession, and the cost of servicing debt skyrocketed. The Latin American debt crisis erupted. First in line was Mexico. On August 12, 1982, Mexico's Finance Minister Jesus Herzog informed the U.S. Fed that Mexico could no longer service its debt, $270 billion in today's money. This sent shock waves through the global financial system. After Mexico's announcement, commercial banks panicked and abruptly stopped all new lending to the region. Contagion spread in 1982 and 1983. Without new money to help service their debts, a dozen other countries defaulted in the region, as seen here. The world's financial elite first tried to treat the Latin debt crisis like a cash flow problem. William Klein proposed a muddling through strategy. Give the countries just enough new loans to pay interest on old loans, provided they accept strict austerity measures. And thus, the IMF stepped in as the lender of last resort. The IMF austerity measures forced governments to slash social spending, freeze wages, and privatize state industries to save money for debt repayment. But for citizens on the street, austerity was a siege. To pay the banks, governments also slashed spending on health and education. Citizens suffered high inflation and economic contraction at the same time. Living standards collapsed. Jeffrey Sachs challenged the muddling through strategy, arguing that Latin America was drowning. He introduced the concept of the debt overhang, explaining that the massive debt acted as a 100% tax on the country's future. The debt killed the incentive to grow. As the 1980s dragged on, a bitter realization set in. The muddling through strategy was fundamentally unfair. Devlin and French Davis showed that the international banks which had lent so recklessly were largely protected by IMF bailouts and official interventions. Meanwhile, Latin American citizens bore the brunt. Per capita GDP plummeted, and the lost decade claimed its name as a generation saw their living standards rolled back by 20 years. By the late 1980s, even the lenders realized the failure of muddling through. The breakthrough came when policy shifted from lending more money to accepting that the debt could not be paid in full. It converted bank loans into Brady Bonds, tradable securities with a lower face value, effectively forgiving a portion of the debt in exchange for guaranteed repayment of the remainder. The average reduction in the face value of the debt, or the haircut, was 30% to 35%. Why did the banks accept the loss from such haircuts? The Brady Plan was successful because it provided collateralization. To make the haircuts palatable, the principal of the new bonds was collateralized by 30-year U.S. Treasury, zero-coupon bonds. By accepting this 35% loss, banks were able to clean up their balance sheets and exit a decade-long cycle of uncertainty. The 1980s LATAM debt crisis ended not with a bang, but with a weary transition to a new economic reality. It reminded the world that financial folly is cyclical. Today's petrodollar euphoria often morphs into tomorrow's lost decade. While LATAM economies returned to growth in the 1990s, scars remained. The crisis was a reminder that the borrower is a servant to the lender until the weight of the debt becomes so heavy that it threatens to pull them both into the abyss. In a phrase attributed to Winston Churchill, history is written by the war victors. And according to Radlett and Friends, financial history is written by the lenders. When debtors default, they are forced to take the blame. It is much more convenient for lenders to ignore their own shortcomings, if not ineptitude when analyzing debtor credit worthiness. Our verified sources are shown here. Write to us in the comments section if your interpretation is different, or if you'd like to suggest other sources. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more financial history from verified sources, subscribe to our channel and join our community striving to learn from the misfortunes of others to avoid similar fates.